You know, when you think about World War II, it's easy to just picture battles and soldiers, but it was so much more than that. It was what we call a total war, and that means the complete mobilization of, well, everyone, entire nations, their economies, their industries, every single citizen, all focused on one thing, winning. So how on earth did governments manage to pull off a war on that kind of epic scale? Well, that's exactly what we're going to break down right now.
So that really brings us to the central question for this whole explainer. How does a regional invasion, something that starts in one corner of Europe, how does that escalate into a global firestorm? A conflict so massive it completely redefines warfare and honestly changes humanity forever. How did that happen?
All right, so to get our heads around this, we're going to walk through 5 key phases. We'll start with the Axis making the first move, then see how the war spread across the globe. We'll look at the incredible effort on the home fronts, pinpoint that exact moment the tide turned, and finally cover the war's dramatic end. Okay, so let's dive into that first phase. It all kicks off with this brand new, absolutely terrifying way of fighting. It was a strategy so brutally effective that it gave the Axis powers this just stunning early advantage. We're talking about bringing most of Europe to its knees in a matter of months. So this German strategy had a name, Blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. And believe me, it lived up to the name. I mean, forget everything you know about the slow, grinding trench warfare of World War I. This was the exact opposite. It was all about incredible speed and total surprise, just punching a hole through enemy lines with tanks and planes to create absolute chaos. The goal wasn't just physical destruction, it was about psychological shock and awe.
And wow, did it work. The results were just staggering. Poland falls in September 1939. Okay, but then, less than a year later, by May of 1940, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and even the mighty French army had all been completely overrun. The speed of it all was just breathtaking. It left the Allies completely and utterly reeling.
But the Blitzkrieg wasn't unstoppable. It finally met its match in the skies over Great Britain. During the Battle of Britain, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, just hammered the UK, trying to bomb the nation into submission. But the Royal Air Force and the British people, they just refused to break. It's what Churchill famously called their finest hour. And this is so important because it was the first time anyone proved that Hitler's war machine wasn't invincible after all.
So, that stand in Britain was absolutely crucial. Why? Because it bought precious time. And in that time, the very nature of the war was about to change. What started out as a European fight was about to become a global struggle, pulling in superpowers from literally every corner of the planet.
Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, you've got the United States, which was officially neutral. But let's be real, it was pretty clear which side they were on. You see this series of escalating steps. America slowly becomes what President Roosevelt famously called the arsenal of democracy. First, they're trading old warships for military bases. Then comes the huge Lend-Lease Act, which was basically like giving Britain and the other allies a blank check for war supplies. So yeah, this wasn't neutrality. It was undeclared economic warfare against the Axis, plain and simple.
At the same time, on the other side of the world, Japan was pushing its own aggressive expansionist agenda in Asia. As a response to its brutal invasion of China, the US hits them with economic sanctions, and the final nail in the coffin is a total oil embargo. Now, you have to understand, for a country like Japan that has almost no natural resources and imports pretty much all its oil, this wasn't just a penalty. It was basically a death sentence for their entire war machine. It totally backed them into a corner and forced them to make a really drastic choice.
And that choice was a military one. On December 7, 1941, Japan launches a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. It was a huge, desperate gamble to try and knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one shot. And while it did a ton of damage, it also, it awakened a sleeping giant. The U.S. declares war on Japan almost immediately. Then, just a few days later, in what has to be one of the biggest miscalculations in history, Hitler declares war on the United States. And right there, in that moment, bam, the separate wars in Europe and Asia fuse together. The conflict is now truly global.
So now, the whole world is at war, and victory isn't just going to be decided by soldiers and generals on the battlefield anymore. Nope. It's going to be decided on the factory assembly lines, out in the farm fields, and really, in the hearts and minds of everyday civilians. We're talking about the home fronts.
And this is where you see a huge difference in how each country's government and their core beliefs shaped the war effort, right? In the democratic U.S., you get Rosie the Riveter, this powerful symbol of women voluntarily joining the workforce. In Britain, it's all about the incredible resilience of civilians during the bombing raids of the Blitz. But then you look at totalitarian Germany and Japan, and it's a totally different story. Mobilization there meant absolute iron-fisted control.
propaganda, censorship, and the horrific use of forced labor from conquered people in concentration camps, all to fuel their war machines. And make no mistake, this mobilization was truly global. I want you to think about this number for a second. 2.5 million. That's the number of men just from the Indian Army who voluntarily signed up to fight for the Allies. It's an incredible figure, and it's a powerful reminder that this war was fought by people from all over the world, including colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. And that sacrifice, as we'll see, would later fuel their own struggles for independence.
So for the first few years of the war, let's be honest, the Axis powers looked pretty much unstoppable. But by the end of 1942, things started to change. The massive industrial power and the sheer number of soldiers the Allies could bring to the fight, it all started to make a difference. The whole momentum of the war was about to shift, and shift dramatically.
And it really comes down to two key battles happening on opposite ends of the world that just broke the back of the Axis advance. Over in the east, you have the Battle of Stalingrad, an absolutely brutal, grinding fight that completely shattered the German army's myth of invincibility. At the same time, in the Pacific, at the Battle of Midway, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, by the way, the U.S. Navy pulls off a stunning ambush and sinks 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers. Here's the key thing to remember. After Stalingrad and Midway, the Axis powers were on the defensive for the rest of the war. The tide had officially turned. So in the Pacific, the Allies had this massive problem. How do you fight your way across a gigantic ocean dotted with thousands of islands? Well, they came up with a really brilliant strategy called island hopping. The idea was, instead of trying to attack every single heavily fortified Japanese island, which would have been a bloodbath, they'd just skip them. They'd bypass the big strongholds, capture smaller, less defended islands, and then turn those islands into air bases. From there, they could bomb the islands they skipped into uselessness and just keep hopping closer and closer to Japan. Super smart. All right, so the tide has turned. The path to an Allied victory is now clear. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Far from it. The final years of the war would be the absolute bloodiest, and they would demand a final, terrible price from everyone involved.
In Europe, the beginning of the end starts on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest sea invasion in all of history. Allied forces storm the beaches of Normandy and just start pushing across France. They liberate Paris, they survive one last, desperate German attack at the Battle of the Bulge, and they keep pushing until they meet up with the Soviet forces who had been fighting their way from the east, right in the streets of Berlin itself. And on May 8, 1945, it was over. Germany surrendered.
But the war wasn't over. Even with victory in Europe, the fight in the Pacific was still raging. An invasion of Japan was on the books, but everyone knew it would cost millions of lives on both sides. But something else was happening. In the deserts of New Mexico, scientists had secretly perfected a new kind of weapon. A weapon that would not only end the war, but change the world forever in a single flash of light.
On August 6, 1945, one American bomber flew over the city of Hiroshima and dropped a single bomb. It was the first time an atomic weapon had ever been used in war, and it unleashed a kind of power the world had never, ever seen before. Just 3 days after that, a second bomb fell on the city of Nagasaki. Faced with this completely unimaginable level of destruction, the Japanese government surrendered unconditionally 5 days later. And just like that, World War II was finally, definitively over.
The war was over, but the cost was just staggering. Let this number sink in. 75 million. That's the estimated number of people who died. And that's not just soldiers. That's soldiers and civilians combined. 75 million. It's a number so huge it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around it. To this day, it is the deadliest conflict in all of human history.
And so, that brings us back to one final big question. The way this war was fought, with entire societies mobilized for battle, with ideologies that could justify any atrocity, and of course, with the creation of atomic weapons, it set a whole new, terrifying precedent for what war could be. So it forces us to ask ourselves right now, what lessons can we take from the conduct of total war, and how does the ghost of that conflict continue to shape the world we live in today?